Sergeant Ray Cooper's compass had been steady for 11 years of Army service, through the length of 2 enlistments and across more open country than most men will ride in a lifetime. And it went to pieces the moment his horse stepped past the mouth of the canyon. He had carried that compass since his first winter in uniform, and he had learned it the way a man learns a tool he depends on, which is to say he had learned its small dishonesties and made allowances for them. He knew that it pulled a little west of True in the high rock country, and that it grew sluggish in the cold, and that it would sit and sulk for a moment after being jostled before it swung around and pointed north again, like a dog returning to its place by the fire. 11 years of that. 11 years of a needle that did what needles do, which is answer to something a man cannot see and can only trust. And in all of those 11 years, the compass had never once done what it did that afternoon in the spring of 1886 in the Arizona Territory, a day's ride southeast of Fort Bowie, in a stretch of broken red country that the maps left blank and the men at the fort had no name for. The canyon opened out of the land the way a wound opens, without warning and without any of the softening that the eye expects. There was no gradual descent, no gathering of foothills, no slope of loose rock to announce it. The ground simply ran flat and hard and sun-baked to a certain line, and past that line it fell away into a shadowed cut in the earth that went down farther than Cooper could see from the saddle, and ran back into the rock farther than he could follow with his eye. The walls of it were the color of old blood where the sun struck them, and the color of a bruise where it did not, and there was a stillness sitting in the mouth of it that Cooper felt before he understood it, the way a man feels a change in the weather in an old break in his arm before the clouds have gathered. He walked his horse up to the line where the flat ground ended, and the horse did not want to go, and he made it go. And the moment the animal's forehooves crossed onto the darker ground of the canyon floor, Cooper felt the compass move in his hand. He looked down at it. The needle was spinning, not drifting, not swinging, not sulking and settling the way it had 1,000 times before. It was spinning, a full slow rotation and then another and then faster, the way a compass behaves in the heart of a lightning storm, except that the Arizona sky above him was clear and blue and empty, from one edge of the world to the other, without a single cloud in it and without so much as a breath of wind to stir the dust. He held the instrument dead level and gave it a moment to come right. It did not come right. He tapped the glass with one finger the way a man taps a stopped watch, and the needle did not so much as pause. It went on turning, smooth and steady and wrong, as though it had found something to point at that was moving in a slow circle around him, or as though the north that it had answered to for 11 years had simply picked itself up and begun to walk. Cooper had been a soldier long enough to distrust his own eyes before he distrusted the world, and so he called back over his shoulder, keeping his voice flat and easy the way a man does when he does not yet want the others to know that anything is wrong. "Webb," he said, "bring your compass up here a minute." Corporal James Webb had been riding drag, keeping their 4-man scout closed up and watching their back trail, which was the job of a careful corporal in country where the Chiricahua bands were still out and still fighting, and where a small detail could be swallowed whole and never heard of again. That spring, the whole territory was strung tight over Geronimo, who had broken from the reservation and gone south into the mountains, and there was not a man at Fort Bowie who rode out beyond the pickets without thinking about it. Webb was a careful man in careful country. He pulled his horse up alongside Cooper's, and he took his own compass out of his coat, and he looked at it, and then he looked at Cooper, and the easy expression that Cooper had worked to keep on his own face was not on Webb's at all. "Sergeant," Webb said, "mine's doing the same thing." They sat their horses side by side at the mouth of the canyon and watched 2 compasses spin. Webb held his low and Cooper held his high, a good 6 feet of air between the 2 instruments, and it made no difference. Both needles turned at the same slow rate, and Cooper watched them for a while and understood that they were turning together, in step, as though they were 2 hands on the same clock, and the understanding of that put a cold feeling in him that had nothing to do with the temperature of the air, except that the temperature of the air was wrong too, and he noticed it now that he had stopped moving. Behind them, out on the flat, the day had been a hot one, the kind of dry spring heat that sits on the shoulders and pulls the sweat out of a man and dries it before it can do him any good. Here at the mouth of the canyon the air was cool, Not the ordinary coolness of shade, which a man expects and welcomes and can explain, but a settled, standing coolness that seemed to come up out of the ground itself, out of the dark cut in the earth, the way cold comes up off a river at night. There was no wind to carry it. It simply was, the way the stillness simply was, sitting in the mouth of the canyon and reaching out a little way onto the flat as though the place had a border to it that was not marked on any map. It was then that Cooper looked up the canyon toward the fourth man of their detail and saw that the Apache scout riding point had already stopped. The scout's name was Nantan, which was not the name his mother had given him, but the one the army had written on its rolls, and he was a Chiricahua, and Cooper had ridden with him for 2 years and had come to trust him the way a cavalryman trusts a good rifle, which is completely and without sentiment, and with the full knowledge that his life might one day hang on it. Nantan read country the way other men read a printed page. He could look at a patch of ground that told Cooper nothing at all and tell him how many riders had crossed it and how long ago and whether their horses were tired. In 2 years, Cooper had learned to watch Nantan the way a hunting man watches his dog, because Nantan noticed things well before he spoke of them, and the noticing showed in the set of his shoulders and the tilt of his head long before any word came. Nantan had stopped his horse before Cooper's compass had begun to spin. He had stopped it, Cooper realized, back when they were still out on the flat, and he had let the others ride past him toward the canyon mouth. And now he sat his horse a little apart and looked down into the cut in the earth with a stillness that Cooper had seen on him only a handful of times in 2 years, and never quite like this. It was the stillness of a man reading something, but it was more than that. It was the stillness of a man who has read the thing already long ago and did not want to find himself standing in front of it again. Cooper walked his horse up beside him. The fourth man, a young private named Doyle who had come out from Ohio the way Cooper himself had years before, held back with Webb, and the two of them watched their compasses and said nothing, and their silence was its own kind of talking. "Nantan," Cooper said, "what do you see?" Nantan did not answer for a long moment. When he did, he spoke in the careful, deliberate English he used when the Apache word would have been the truer one, and he did not trust Cooper to carry the weight of it. "This place," he said. "My grandfather told me about this place." Cooper waited. He had learned that much about riding with the man that you did not hurry him. "He told me," Nantan went on, "that soldiers came asking about it before your fort was as old as it is now. They wanted a man to guide them into it. And he did not guide them, and he did not tell them what he knew because he said that the ones who go far into it do not come back out the same, and he was not going to be the man who sent white soldiers into it, and then be blamed by his own people and by yours when they came out changed. So he said nothing. He let them think he did not know the country, and they went in a little way, and something in there turned them around, and they came back out, and they did not thank him, and they did not curse him, because they did not know he had known. That is the story he told me. And he told me that if I ever rode with soldiers who came to this place, I should tell them to turn around, and that was the only part of it that was mine to tell." Cooper looked down at his compass. It was still spinning. He looked back up the canyon, into the shadowed cut where the red walls closed in on one another, and he tried to see how far back it ran, and he found that he could not. The eye followed the walls in and lost them, not in darkness exactly, and not in distance exactly, but in a kind of blurring of the far end that Cooper's eye kept trying to resolve and could not. The way a man's eye slides off a word he cannot quite read. It went back farther than it should have. He could not have said why he was so certain of that, except that a lifetime of judging distance across open country had left him with an instinct for how far a thing ought to be, and the far end of the canyon was farther than it ought to have been, and it stayed farther no matter how long he looked at it. "Nantan," Cooper said, "are you telling me to turn around?" Nantan turned his head and looked at him, and on his face was an expression that Cooper had never seen there in 2 years of riding together. It was not fear, or not only fear. It was the specific weariness of a man who has decided to say the thing he had promised himself he would not have to say. "I am telling you," Nantan said, "that my grandfather kept his word to his own people by not telling the soldiers before you. And I am breaking his word to keep mine to you. He told me to send you back. He did not tell me to explain it because he could not explain it himself, and neither can I. Turn around, Sergeant. This canyon is old. It was old before your army came, and it was old before my grandfather's grandfather came, and it does not care about your orders, and it does not care about your maps, and it does not care that your compass no longer knows where north is. The ones who go far in do not come out the way they went in. That is what my grandfather told me, and in all my life I never once knew him to lie. Cooper sat his horse and thought about that, and while he thought, he looked at the country in front of him, and he began to notice the things that a man notices when he has finally stopped and gone quiet, and let the place come to him. The first thing was the silence. He had ridden in silent country before, in the dead heat of the desert afternoon when even the lizards go still, but this was not that. This was a silence with an edge to it, a silence that a man could feel pressing on his ears. Behind them, out on the flat, there had been the ordinary small sounds of the living country all day, the rasp of insects, the far-off complaint of a hawk, the dry rattle of the wind through the brush. Here at the mouth of the canyon there was nothing. No insect, no bird, no wind. Cooper could hear his own horse breathing, and he could hear the creak of Webb's saddle behind him, and he could hear the blood moving in his own ears. And past that, there was only the silence, and it was total, and it was waiting. The second thing was the horses. All 4 animals stood with their ears laid back and their heads low, and they were sweating, though the air was cool, and now and then one of them would shift its weight and swing its head toward the canyon, and then away again, and none of them would put a foot forward, not one. Cooper's own horse, which had carried him through gunfire without breaking, stood trembling under him and would not move toward the dark cut in the earth, and when Cooper laid his heel against its flank, the animal only trembled harder and turned its head to look back at him with a white showing all around its eye, and he did not have the heart, and something in him did not have the will to make it go. The third thing was the shadows, and this was the thing that Cooper would think about for the rest of his long life and never once make sense of. The sun stood behind them, and to the right, well down the western sky by that hour, and it threw the shadows of the 4 men and their horses out ahead of them, long and dark across the flat ground toward the mouth of the canyon, which was exactly as it should have been. Cooper's shadow lay out in front of him, long and thin and reaching toward the dark cut, and Webb's beside it, and Doyle's and the horses. That was right. That was the world behaving the way the world behaves. But at the mouth of the canyon, at the line where the flat ground gave over to the darker floor of the cut, there was another shadow, and it did not belong to any of them. It lay across the canyon floor just inside the mouth, long and dark and man-shaped, the shadow of a standing man cast by a low sun, except that it lay in the wrong direction entirely. Where the shadows of Cooper and his men reached toward the canyon, that shadow reached away from it, deeper in, as though it were thrown by a sun standing somewhere down inside the canyon, low in an evening sky that Cooper could not see. There was no man there to cast it. There was nothing there at all but the bare rock of the canyon floor and the long dark shape of a shadow with no man attached to it, lying against the light instead of with it. Cooper looked at it for a long time. He looked from his own shadow to that one and back again, and he checked the position of the sun, and there was no reading of the light, no trick of the walls, no fold in the ground that could account for it. The shadow lay the wrong way. It lay the wrong way because whatever cast it stood in a different afternoon than the one Cooper was standing in, and that was as far as his mind was willing to go with the thing, and he pulled his mind back from it the way a man pulls his hand back from a stove. Beside him, Nantan had followed his eyes to the shadow, and Nantan had already looked away from it, and was looking at Cooper instead, waiting. "Doyle," Cooper said without turning around. "Webb, what does your compass read?" "It don't read, Sergeant," Webb said. His voice had gone careful and small. "It just keeps turning. Doyle's too. We've been watching them turn this whole time." "They turning together," Cooper said. It was not a question. There was a silence behind him, and then Webb said, "Yes, Sergeant, same speed, same time, like they was tied to the one thing." Cooper looked once more into the canyon, at the far end that stayed too far, at the shadow that lay the wrong way, at the cool standing air and the total silence and the shivering horses that would not go forward. He had orders in his saddlebag to survey this ground and to bring back a report of what he found and whether a body of troops could move through it. And he was a man who had spent 11 years doing what he was ordered to do, and he had built his whole life on the plain soldier's understanding that a man does the thing he is told and lets the officers worry over whether it was wise. But he had also spent 11 years learning the difference between the country that will kill a man because he is careless and the country that will do something to a man that is worse than killing him because he is proud. And everything he had learned in those 11 years was standing up in him now and telling him that the sensible thing and the ordered thing had walked away from each other, and that if he followed the orders one step farther into that cut in the earth, he was going to lose something out here that no report would ever bring back. He thought about Nantan, who had ridden at his point for 2 years and had never once steered him wrong, and who had just broken a promise made to a dead grandfather in order to warn him. A man does not do that lightly. A man does not set aside the word of his own blood, given and kept for a lifetime, in order to turn a soldier around on a patch of empty ground. Unless the ground is not empty at all, unless the man knows something in his bones that he cannot put into the borrowed English of the army rolls. Cooper had learned to read Nantan the way Nantan read the country, and everything in the set of the scout's shoulders and the weariness in his face was telling Cooper the same thing that his own instinct was telling him, which was that they had come to a door that was better left shut, and that the only men who ever regretted turning back from it were the ones who had not turned back at all. He turned the detail around. He did it plainly and without ceremony, the way he did everything, saying only, "We're going back. Doyle, take the point. Where Bride drag, Nantan, stay close to me." And the 4 of them wheeled their horses away from the mouth of the canyon, and the horses went eagerly now, almost bolting, and Cooper had to hold his own animal down to a walk to keep the detail together. He rode last but for Webb, and he made himself look back once over his shoulder at the dark cut in the earth, and the shadow that did not belong to any of them still lay across the canyon floor exactly as it had, reaching deeper in, cast by a sun that was not in Cooper's sky. And as he watched, it did not move, and he turned his face forward again and did not look back a second time. The compass came right the moment they crossed back out onto the flat. He felt it happen. He was holding the instrument in his left hand, watching it turn, and they walked the horses back across the invisible border of that place, out of the cool standing air and into the ordinary hot wind of the Arizona afternoon, and between one stride of his horse and the next, the needle simply stopped its turning, and swung and shivered and settled and pointed north. It pointed a little west of True, the way it always had in the high rock country, the small familiar dishonesty of a tool he had trusted for 11 years, and Cooper looked at that small honest error and felt something in his chest come loose that he had not known was bound up tight. Behind him, he heard Webb let out a long breath. Somewhere off on the flat a hawk called, and an insect started up its rasping in the brush, and the world was full of its small, ordinary noise again, and the silence was behind them, sitting in the mouth of the canyon where it had always sat, waiting. They rode back to Fort Bowie through the last of the light and into the dark, and no man among them said much, and Nantan rode close to Cooper the whole way, as he had been told to, and once, in the full dark, Cooper said to him quietly, "Thank you," and Nantan said nothing back, because there was nothing that needed saying, and they both knew it. Cooper wrote his report the next morning. He was a careful man with words when carefulness was called for, and he chose these with the deliberate care of a man who wants to tell the truth in such a way that no one will ask him to say more of it. He wrote that the canyon presented, in his words, impassable geological and magnetic conditions rendering survey infeasible with the instruments available to the detail, and that in his judgment no body of troops could be moved through it to any advantage, and he signed his name to it and carried it to his lieutenant. It was true, every word of it, in the sense that it was not false. The instruments had been made useless. The ground could not be surveyed. A man does not need to write down every reason a thing cannot be done. His lieutenant read it and looked at Cooper for a moment, and Cooper looked back at him steadily, and the lieutenant, who had been at Fort Bowie long enough to know that when Sergeant Ray Cooper said a piece of ground could not be surveyed, then the piece of ground could not be surveyed, folded the report and put it in the file and said only, "Very well, Sergeant, we'll leave it off the map." And that was the end of it in the Army's eyes. Cooper was not asked to go back. He was not asked to try again with better instruments. The canyon stayed a blank space on the maps of the Arizona Territory, a place with no name and no lines drawn through it, and if any other detail was ever sent to it, Cooper never heard of them, and he chose to believe that meant no other detail ever was. He served out the rest of his enlistment. That autumn, Geronimo came in and surrendered for the last time, and the long war in the mountains was over, and the territory began the slow business of becoming a quieter place, and Cooper did his soldier's work and kept his mouth shut about the canyon and thought about it only in the way a man thinks about a thing he has decided not to think about, which is to say often and against his will, in the quiet hours. He mustered out in 1889, and he shook Nantan's hand on the day he left, and the two men looked at each other, and neither one of them mentioned the canyon because it lay between them already, understood and settled, the way the deepest things between two men often are. He went home to Ohio. He married and farmed and raised his family, and grew old the slow way that a man grows old when he has come through his dangerous years and been given the gift of ordinary ones, and he lived to be 81. And in all of that long life, he told the story of the canyon exactly once near the very end of it. In the last year he was alive, which was 1932, to his grandson, who was a boy of 12 then and old enough, Cooper judged, to be trusted with it. They were sitting on the porch in the evening, the two of them, and the boy had been pestering his grandfather for a war story, the way boys do, wanting Apaches and gunfire and cavalry charges, and the old man had been quiet for a while, and then he had said that he would tell the boy the truest thing that ever happened to him in the army, and that it had no gunfire in it at all, and the boy had been disappointed until his grandfather began to speak, and then he was not disappointed anymore. "I turned around," the old man told him. "That is the whole of the story, when you come down to it. I had my orders and I turned around, and I have never once in 46 years been sorry that I did. I turned around because a man I trusted broke his own grandfather's word in order to warn me, and when a man does that, when he sets aside the thing that is most sacred to him in order to tell you to stop, you had better stop because he is telling you something with his whole life that he cannot find the words for. Nantan could not have told me in plain words what was down in that canyon. I do not think there were any plain words for it. But he could tell me to turn around, and he paid a great deal to be able to tell me that, and I listened. And here I am, 81 years old, telling you about it on this porch, and I will tell you what I have decided in all these years of turning it over, because I have turned it over a great deal. And this is where I have come to rest. There are places in this country, the old man said, that were old before we ever came to it. The people who were here before us knew about those places. They did not have our maps, and they did not have our compasses, and they did not have our orders. But they had something we did not have, which was the sense to leave certain ground alone, and the humility to warn their grandsons to leave it alone as well. We came in with all our instruments and all our confidence and all our belief that a thing that can be measured can be understood, and a thing that can be reached can be taken. And every so often we came up against a piece of ground that answered us. It answered by spinning the compass. It answered by throwing a shadow the wrong way. It answered by going farther back into the rock than the eye should be able to follow. And the ones of us who lived to grow old, the ones of us who are sitting on our porches at 81 talking to our grandsons, were the ones who understood what that answer meant. It meant the ground itself was asking us, as politely as the ground knows how to ask, to go somewhere else. So I went somewhere else, the old man said. I went home. Nantan went back to his people, and I have hoped every day of my life since that the world treated him better than it treated most of the men who scouted for us, though I have my doubts, because I know how the world was in those years. And the canyon stayed exactly where it was, doing whatever it is that it does to compasses and to shadows and to men who go too far into it, waiting for the next detail to come along with orders in the saddlebag and no sense in the head. And I have prayed more than once that whoever came after me, if anyone ever did, had a scout as good as Nantan and the plain wit to listen to him. That is the whole of the story, the old man said to the boy, and the whole of what 11 years in the army taught me, and it has served me every day of my life since. When the ground asks you to go somewhere else, you go somewhere else. You do not need to understand it. You do not need to be able to write it in a report. You only need the sense to turn your horse around and the humility to be grateful for the rest of your days that you were given the chance. And then the old man was quiet, and the evening came down over the porch, and the boy sat with him in the dark for a long time and did not ask for another story, because he understood, young as he was, that there was not going to be another one. That this had been the only one that ever really mattered.